I was standing on my porch with a garden hose in hand when the pressure suddenly died, and a slow, wheezing gasp of air came out instead of water. I blinked twice, gave the hose a shake, and turned the faucet off and back on again, but nothing changed. Just that pathetic hiss like a dying balloon. It was the fourth day of a brutal heat wave, and the city had already placed water restrictions. I'd complied down to the last drop. So why was my line empty? I turned toward my front yard, scanning for any signs of a burst pipe, but that's when I heard it, this low, rhythmic gurgling like a jacuzzi bubbling at full blast. The sound didn't come from my property, but from the other side of the wooden fence I shared with my neighbor Karen. And then it hit me, not just the sound, but a puff of hot, chlorine-scented steam wafting over the top like a taunt. My eyes narrowed. I followed the sound like a bloodhound, crept to the edge of the fence, and peeked over. And there she was, Karen, lounging like Cleopatra in a steaming hot tub, oversized sunglasses, pink bathrobe slipping off one shoulder, and in her hand, a goblet of white wine at 11 a.m. My jaw clenched. But what made my blood boil wasn't her luxurious soak during a water crisis. It was the long green hose, clearly mine, stretched from her tub all the way under the fence and into my spigot. I wasn't just losing water. I was filling Karen's spa day. I cleared my throat loudly enough for a marching band. She didn't flinch. I raised my voice and said, "Hey Karen? That's my water line you're using." She tilted her head slightly, as if the wind was making some funny noise, then went back to sipping her wine and adjusting her bubble jet. The audacity was Olympic level. Not just theft, blatant, arrogant, entitled theft. I marched over to the fence gate and knocked twice, firm and fast. Still nothing. I knocked again, harder this time. Finally, Karen lifted her glasses, made direct eye contact with me, and said, "Oh, is something the matter? I'm having my self-care hour." Her voice was sugary poison. "You're stealing my water during a drought," I snapped. "You've got your hose running right from my faucet." Karen slowly blinked, tilted her head to the side and said, "Oh relax, it's just water. You weren't using it anyway." I actually laughed. The kind of laugh people let out when reality bends too far. I told her to disconnect it immediately. She smiled, then turned up her Bluetooth speaker and closed her eyes as if I wasn't even there. When I called the HOA, they asked me to submit a formal complaint with photos, signatures, timestamps, and a written explanation of the confrontation. I did all of it, including footage from my porch camera clearly showing Karen dragging the hose over to her side. I expected a clear outcome. Instead, I got fined. The letter said, "Violation of Community Civility Code, accusatory behavior toward neighbor." Apparently, Karen beat me to the punch and reported me for verbal intimidation and harassment over a gardening hose. I was stunned. Not only had she stolen my utilities, but now I was being penalized for calling it out. That night, I sat in my kitchen stewing in silence, nursing a can of soda and rereading the fine letter like it would suddenly make sense the 20th time. It didn't. Karen had twisted the story in record time and got the HOA eating from her manicured hand. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my saved contact. I paused on one name, J. Mudline Castillo, an old buddy of mine who now worked sanitation for the city. If anyone knew how to reroute fluids legally and creatively, it was Jay. I hit call. After a few rings, his familiar raspy voice answered, "Nate, haven't heard from you since the sewer backup at the ballpark. What's up?" I grinned and said, "Buddy, you ever hear of someone using a neighbor's water line to fill a hot tub?" Jay laughed like a hyena. "That's a new level of freeloading." I leaned back in my chair. I need a little plumbing help. But more importantly, I need it to stink. Jay and I met the next day under the guise of garden repairs. We stood by the side of my house, inspecting the outdoor spigot Karen had hijacked. Jay looked it over with a smirk. "What do you want coming out of this? Just stink water? Or full-on sewer burp?" I said, somewhere between rotten footbath and zombie swamp. He chuckled, scratched his chin, and said, "I've got a spare sump pump from an old project. There's an old greywater maintenance line just under your crawl space. Legal to tap as long as it doesn't mix with domestic plumbing." I looked him dead in the eye. "Can we make it look normal until she turns it on?" Jay grinned. "Oh, I can make it poetic." 2 nights later, while the neighborhood slept and Karen's tub stood dry and arrogant, Jay and I installed the valve. It looked like a regular connection from the outside, but when flipped, it switched from clean water to the foulest reservoir south of the property line. The handle was hidden under a decorative stone gnome I bought just for the occasion. And just like that, we had a trap ready to spring. The next morning, like clockwork, Karen strolled out with her usual sun hat and Bluetooth speaker. She wheeled out the tub lid, flopped it open, and dragged the hose from her side of the fence. I watched from behind my blinds as she attached it to the intake valve of her beloved hot tub, then traipsed over to my spigot and gave it a twist. Water began to flow. She didn't know I had already flipped the secret valve 2 hours ago. This wasn't water. This was sewer soul soup. And she was about to bathe in it. But I didn't film yet. Not on day 1. This was reconnaissance. I needed her to think everything was normal. The trap had been baited. The gnome stood guard. The hose was back in her corner. And soon, very soon, she'd settle in for her bubbly soak, lean back, and inhale the first scent of what she thought was lavender. But it wouldn't be lavender. It would be vengeance. The next day rolled around with a heat wave worse than the last. My lawn had started to yellow, my tomatoes were shriveling, and I was beginning to wonder if this entire summer would pass without a single drop of mercy from the clouds. But even as the sun scorched the pavement and heat shimmered off the rooftops, one corner of the neighborhood seemed immune to drought. Karen's backyard. Around 10 a.m., I heard the now familiar hiss of her hose dragging across concrete. I didn't even need to look anymore. Her routine was consistent. Roll out the hot tub cover, set up her Bluetooth speaker, crank up some generic spa playlist, and start stealing water from my faucet like it was her personal well. But this time I was ready. The trap had been set. The gnome was sitting stoically above the valve, and I had already flipped it to greywater mode early that morning. Karen, completely oblivious, had no idea her pampered paradise was about to become a cesspool. I sat inside with a fresh cup of iced coffee, watching her through the side window blind. She twisted the spigot handle, and the hose filled with pressure. Only this time, it wasn't the clean, filtered city water she was used to. It was recycled waste fluid, pumped straight from a rarely used maintenance tunnel that Jay had tapped into. The sewer system below our neighborhood had an old greywater retention line that never got removed when the newer systems were installed. Still legal. Still nasty. And Karen had just invited it into her life like a welcome guest. I watched her dip a toe into the tub as it began to fill. She didn't seem to notice anything unusual at first. The water temperature probably felt warm enough under the sun. I even saw her do a little happy dance, clearly thrilled she'd once again pulled off her spa day on someone else's dime. She took off her cover-up and climbed in, leaned back against the inflated rim of the tub, and closed her eyes like she was in some 5-star resort. That's when the first hint of sourness must have hit her nose. Her eyebrows twitched. She sniffed once, then waved a hand in front of her face like maybe a squirrel had died nearby. She shifted in the tub, trying to ignore it, but as the bubbles kicked in, the greywater finally started doing what greywater does. The tub foamed, not white and clean, but yellowish and sickly. Clumps floated up. Karen sat bolt upright, squinting into the murky water. She reached down and scooped some up into her palm, sniffed it directly, and then immediately screamed. She scrambled backward, slipping and flailing as she tried to leap out of the tub like it had turned into boiling oil. Her foot caught the edge, she flipped sideways, and landed face-first into her own lawn. I watched, wide-eyed, hand over my mouth, trying not to laugh. She rolled over, dripping in sewer sludge and flailing around like she'd just escaped quicksand. From inside my house, I could still hear her shrieking. "What the hell is this? What is this?" she yelled, staggering around in a soapy mess that was anything but soap. She grabbed a towel, but that was no help. It just smeared the brown-tinged water all over her arms and legs. Her Bluetooth speaker, still playing a song about waterfalls and peace, only made it more absurd. One of her friends came running over from across the street, saw the mess, and immediately backed up with both hands raised like Karen was radioactive. "Oh my God, what happened?" her friend asked. "It smells like, oh no. Oh no no no." Karen gagged and then, very dramatically, vomited into a flower bed. I turned away, partly out of pity, mostly because I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. My plan had worked even better than expected. She hadn't just been inconvenienced, she had been completely humiliated by her own greed. But I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to suffer in silence. That same evening, I got a knock at the door. I opened it to find her standing on my front step, soaked hair in a bun, wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that could peel paint. In her hand was a manila envelope. "You think you're clever?" she hissed. "This is going to cost you everything." I raised an eyebrow. "You stole my water," she sneered. "And you poisoned me with sewage. That's assault." She threw the envelope at my chest and stormed off. Inside was a letter that appeared to be from a law firm, though a quick Google search told me otherwise. The lawyer listed at the bottom didn't even exist in our state's bar registry. It was a fake letter, probably something she'd paid for online to scare me. Still, I scanned the contents and forwarded it to a real attorney I knew, just in case. The next day, as expected, I received another letter, this time from the HOA. They were responding to a new complaint from Karen about illegal plumbing work and public health violations. I was once again the villain in her twisted version of events. The HOA requested an inspection of my outdoor line. I knew they'd try something like this. Thankfully, I had Jay document the entire modification process with timestamps, blueprints, and a notarized statement showing the greywater line was entirely separate from the house system. I sent them everything, plus a note of my own, and unlike my neighbor, I'm not using stolen resources for personal spa treatments. That didn't stop Karen. She started posting passive-aggressive notes on our community board about biohazards and irresponsible neighbors polluting family spaces. She even tried to gather signatures to have me removed from the HOA entirely, citing me as a toxic influence. Of course, only 2 people signed it. One was her, and the other was her part-time dog walker. What Karen didn't know was that I wasn't the only one keeping tabs. Several neighbors had quietly reached out to me in private, thanking me for standing up to her. Apparently, I wasn't the first person Karen had exploited. One neighbor said she had connected a makeshift drain to someone else's gutter during a storm last year, causing their basement to flood. Another recalled how she'd once plugged her extension cord into their outdoor outlet to power a holiday party. She'd been stealing water, electricity, and goodwill for years. But no one had dared confront her, until now. I spent the following weekend reinforcing my outdoor plumbing, adding a lockable cage to my spigot, and installing a secondary valve just for extra control. The gnome stayed put, he'd earned his place. As for Karen, she disappeared from her yard for a while. No music, no tub, no wine glasses resting on the patio rail. But I knew it was only temporary. People like her don't just stop. They regroup. They retaliate. And sure enough, within a few days, I saw her pacing around her backyard with a clipboard and tape measure. She was planning something new. I just didn't know what yet. But one thing was certain. The war over water had only just begun. The silence didn't last long. Karen might have been humiliated, but she wasn't the type to crawl away and lick her wounds. She was the type to reload. Within a week of the sewer-soaked spa incident, she was back on her feet, literally pacing her backyard in what looked like a designer tracksuit, muttering into her phone and gesturing wildly at her fence, her deck, even at the sky like it had wronged her. I watched from my kitchen window as she stopped near the hose she'd once stolen and began taking photos with her phone. Not of the hose itself, but of my yard, my spigot, even my security camera. Something was coming. I just didn't know what form it would take yet. Then came the envelope. This one wasn't hand-delivered with venom. It arrived by certified mail. Inside was a fresh complaint, this time not from Karen but from a law office that, after some research, turned out to be real. Her letter claimed emotional distress, health violations, and exposure to biohazardous waste materials leading to psychological trauma. She wanted compensation, financial damages, a public apology, and the removal of hazardous plumbing installations on my property. I stared at the letter in disbelief. She was trying to sue me for polluting her hot tub with water she stole from my faucet. It was like a burglar tripping on a coffee table during a robbery and then demanding you replace their shoes. I contacted my lawyer, sent him all the documents, the security footage, the HOA correspondence, and the blueprints Jay had prepared for the greywater modification. My lawyer, Mike, laughed halfway through the call. He said her case wouldn't last 2 minutes in front of a judge. She's admitting to using your water without permission, and she's trying to hold you responsible for what came out of your own spigot? Let her try, he said. Still, Mike agreed to prepare a formal response to the lawsuit and get ahead of any real damage. Karen was persistent, but she wasn't smart. Her plan was based on the assumption that I'd panic and settle. But I wasn't scared. I was entertained. The next escalation came through the HOA. A new violation notice was posted to my mailbox, printed in red ink and bold typeface. It claimed I had made unauthorized alterations to property-facing infrastructure that could affect community drainage systems. I knew exactly who filed it. But what made me laugh out loud was the attached image, a photo of my garden hose with a red arrow pointing at the gnome. Apparently, the gnome had been labeled suspicious landscaping, and was now considered a non-compliant concealment of mechanical plumbing. I couldn't make this up if I tried. They were going after a decorative statue now. Instead of getting angry, I decided it was time to fire a shot of my own. Not through shouting, not through sabotage, but by using something Karen would never expect: paperwork. I took every document I had, from her theft to her misuse of plumbing to her fabricated HOA reports, and compiled a comprehensive complaint. But I didn't send it to the HOA. I sent it to the local health department. I attached photos, video stills, and even highlighted the footage of Karen's hot tub runoff leaking down her driveway into the storm drain, something that could violate environmental ordinances if left unchecked. And then, to really make sure it didn't get lost in the pile, I forwarded a copy to a local news columnist who ran a piece called Neighborhood Shenanigans. They loved stories like this. A week later, the fallout began. A white city vehicle pulled up in front of Karen's house. Out stepped 2 people in uniforms with clipboards. They walked around her property for 15 minutes before knocking on her door. Karen stepped out in a robe, visibly annoyed. She gestured wildly, tried to smile, tried to scowl, and then tried to blame the fence line. But the inspectors weren't there for arguments. They wrote things down, took samples from her yard, measured runoff points. By the time they left, Karen was fuming. She looked up and saw me watching from my porch with a cup of iced tea. I raised the glass in salute. She flipped me off and slammed her door. 2 days later, a neon orange notice was taped to the front of Karen's garage. It read, "Warning: unlicensed plumbing modifications under investigation." It was the kind of sign that made neighbors whisper, and whisper they did. I got texts from 2 houses down, 3 houses up, even the nice couple across the cul-de-sac. People wanted to know what Karen had done this time. Apparently, no one liked her. They just feared her wrath. But now that someone had stood up to her, and made her look ridiculous, people started telling stories. About how she had once rerouted gutter runoff onto someone else's vegetable bed. About how she'd borrowed someone's power outlet for her Christmas lights without asking. and how she used to sneak into a neighbor's garden to cut lavender, claiming it was for her anxiety. But the real game changer came when I got a knock on the door from someone I didn't expect to see. A guy in his late 40s, scruffy beard, wearing a faded blue polo with a logo from a roofing company. He introduced himself as Evan, Karen's ex-husband. He'd seen the neighborhood column about the hot tub incident and decided it was time to speak up. We sat in my backyard as he told me everything. How Karen had always played the victim. How she'd stolen utility access in their previous home too. And how she manipulated people, twisted stories, and weaponized bureaucracy to get her way. Evan handed me a USB drive. This has old photos and documents from when we lived here together. I kept them for legal reasons in case she ever tried to take me back to court. He explained that the photos showed the same kind of scams: illegal cable hookups, rerouted pipes, even a temporary sewer bypass she built during a pool renovation. I thanked him, promised I'd put it to good use, and let him know he wasn't alone anymore. Evan looked relieved. "You're the first person who's actually stood up to her and made it stick. Good luck, man." That night, I went through the files. There were dated photos of Karen tapping into neighbors' outdoor lines, using makeshift pumps, even a handwritten list of what days certain houses were usually empty. It was like a blueprint for freeloading. I backed up the files, printed the best ones, and made another quiet submission, this time to the HOA board and the local Utilities Enforcement Division. Karen had no idea what was coming. She thought she was playing checkers while the rest of us played chess. But I had just found the queen piece, and I was ready to flip the whole board. It started with whispers and glances, the kind that spread like gasoline on dry grass. Karen didn't know it yet, but the fuse was already burning under her feet. The column had gone live that morning, featuring a picture of her lounging in the now infamous hot tub, mid-scream, as the foul water erupted around her. The headline was impossible to miss. Spa Queen gets sewer surprise after stealing neighbor's water, justice bubbles over. Beneath it, the story unfolded like a dramatic comedy, loaded with witness quotes, timestamps, and even a blurry image of the decorative gnome that marked the secret valve. The piece didn't name her directly, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who it was. The image alone made it obvious, and the reporter had done an excellent job of telling the story in a way that let Karen's own actions hang her out to dry. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't walk to the mailbox without a neighbor waving or smirking. Some folks passed by pretending to stretch, just to get a look at Karen's now drained and covered hot tub. Others slowed down while jogging, peeking into her yard like it was a crime scene. Karen, meanwhile, had pulled all her blinds shut and hadn't been seen outside since the article dropped. But it didn't stop there. The story made its way to a local Facebook community page, then Reddit, and by evening it had been reposted on 3 neighborhood gossip accounts and a regional news aggregator. People were laughing, sharing their own run-ins with petty neighbors, and flooding the comments with praise for Nate the Gnome King. That wasn't my idea, but it stuck fast and hard. The attention alone might have been survivable, but the consequences that followed were not. A white van from the city's environmental health department showed up the next morning. This time, they weren't just inspecting, they had orders. Karen stood at her front door, arms crossed and trembling with barely contained fury, as the officials taped a temporary closure notice on the hot tub. They asked her a series of questions while one of them photographed the drainage area and collected samples from the concrete slab. The inspector politely informed her that due to improper waste disposal and lack of certified plumbing work, her hot tub had been classified as a community health risk. She would either need to bring it up to code or have it removed permanently. Karen argued. She shouted. She called someone on the phone, pacing in her slippers and barking into the receiver like a CEO having a meltdown. But the officials didn't care. They were just there to enforce the orders. A second crew arrived around noon with masks and gloves, and the sight of them wrapping the tub in industrial plastic and loading it onto a flatbed truck might as well have been a parade. A few neighbors even clapped from their porches. Karen screamed at them too. "You think this is funny? This is harassment. I'll have you all sued." One old man across the street shouted back, "You already tried, sweetheart. Didn't work." She flipped him off, and he raised a can of soda in salute. By that evening, Karen's yard looked like the aftermath of a failed science experiment. The tub was gone. The surrounding grass was brown from chemical soap. Her patio furniture was stained with the lingering evidence of her entitlement. And through it all, she remained hidden inside, blinds down, lights off. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then came the flyer. Folded neatly into every mailbox was a sheet from Karen titled, "A Message from a Harassed Resident." It was a rant-filled page blaming everyone from me to the HOA to the media. She claimed the article was fake, the photos were edited, and she had been the victim of a neighborhood witch hunt. She even accused the Environmental Health Department of targeting her due to a coordinated smear campaign. It was so wild it bordered on parody. Most people threw it away. Some posted photos of it online with sarcastic captions. One even framed it and taped it to their garage door like modern art. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Karen had been exposed, embarrassed, and rendered irrelevant. But she had one more move to play. A week later, I noticed a real estate sign staked in front of her lawn. At first, I thought she was trying to sell quietly, hoping to disappear before the next round of gossip hit. But I was wrong. The listing wasn't quiet, it was explosive. A realtor's website had posted it with photos of the house and backyard, all pristine and digitally enhanced, with a glowing description that made it sound like a suburban paradise. "Stunning Sparretti backyard oasis," it read. "Ideal for entertaining and self-care retreats." The hot tub, long gone, was still pictured in its former bubbly glory. The caption beneath it even said, "Fully permitted luxury spa system, recently serviced." That was the final straw. I forwarded the listing to the same reporter who had run the original column, along with a polite note that said, "Thought you might enjoy this fictional reboot." Within 24 hours, a follow-up article dropped, "Hot Tub Hoax, Spa System in Viral Story Still Being Marketed Online." The article called out the false advertising, included before and after pictures, and confirmed with the city that no such permits existed. The real estate agent dropped the listing the next day. Karen's property went from hot commodity to cold lead in an instant. By now, the story had taken on a life of its own. Karen had become a meme, a cautionary tale, and an online example of entitlement gone wrong. But Karen wasn't quite finished. Her last-ditch effort was what she called a healing circle, where she invited neighbors to gather in her yard to talk about moving forward together. She even passed out pastel-colored invitations folded like little paper swans. Not one person showed up. Not one. The only thing that landed in her yard that day was a gag gift left anonymously, a pool rules sign bolted to a chunk of fake concrete, reading "No unauthorized soaking. Especially in sewer sauce." I knew exactly who had sent it. Me. But I didn't need credit. Just seeing her expression when she found it made everything worth it. By the end of the month, Karen's house still hadn't sold. The listing bounced from agency to agency, each time more desperate, the price dropping in $5,000 chunks. People remembered the headlines. They remembered the smell. And no amount of digital landscaping could scrub the story off her property. She had tried to control the narrative. She had tried to twist reality. But in the end, she learned something the hard way. You can only steal so much before the stink catches up to you. By the time the summer began to fade, the neighborhood had returned to a strange sort of normal. The HOA stopped sending me warning letters. The Environmental Health Department had closed the file. And the infamous spa saga had finally slipped off the trending charts. But around here, nobody forgot. Karen's house sat unsold for weeks, then months, with a price tag that dipped lower than anyone expected for a property in this area. The realtors kept changing, each one showing up with professional smiles and leaving with awkward apologies. Some tried to market it as a fixer-upper with unique neighborhood charm. Others avoided the backyard altogether. But the local legend couldn't be buried beneath a coat of paint and new shutters. The minute a prospective buyer asked a neighbor, the truth poured out like a geyser. Karen tried everything. She replaced the lawn, repainted the fence, even offered a discount on closing costs and added free appliances. None of it worked. The home had a ghost, one soaked in sewer foam and entitlement, and no one wanted to inherit it. As for Karen, she became something of a recluse. Gone were her morning soaks, her loud music, her passive-aggressive yoga sessions. She stayed inside most days, occasionally popping out to glare at whoever dared walk by too slowly. Some neighbors said she had started making calls to lawyers in other states, hoping to find someone willing to sue the city, the HOA, maybe even the newspaper. No one took her seriously anymore. Her tantrums had become background noise. She had no allies left. Even her usual clique, those who had once nodded along with her ridiculous declarations, had stopped visiting. Her house, once the self-proclaimed sanctuary of community wellness, now sat quiet, its windows like eyes that no longer watched, but sulked. Meanwhile, life on my side of the fence was finally peaceful. My garden was recovering, thanks to better water pressure and new irrigation. The birds had returned. The neighborhood dogs stopped barking every time someone passed Karen's property. Even the air felt lighter. It was like a storm had moved on, leaving the sunshine to return. I added a second security camera and locked the gnome in place with a small chain, just for the symbolism. The trap was no longer needed, but its legacy was too legendary to remove. People started dropping by more often. One neighbor brought fresh lemon bars as thanks for standing up for all of us. Another neighbor offered to help repaint my front gate, saying they were glad someone finally called her bluff. I never asked for the attention. I didn't want a parade. But hearing stories from others, how she'd borrowed tools and never returned them, or blamed their kids for garden damage that turned out to be raccoons, only confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Karen had been a problem long before the hot tub hose slithered into my life. I'd just been the first to say no. A few weeks later, I was sitting out back one evening, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, when a manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. For a split second, I felt that familiar jolt, another complaint, another legal threat, another wave of drama? But when I opened it, it was something entirely unexpected. Inside was a letter from the HOA board, addressed personally to me. It wasn't another warning. It was an apology. They acknowledged their mishandling of the early complaints and their failure to properly investigate Karen's accusations. They also informed me that Karen's fines had been reinstated following the health department's findings, and that her HOA privileges were now suspended indefinitely. The letter ended with a surprising request. Would I be willing to consider joining the HOA board? They were looking for members who actually understood how to handle real issues. I laughed out loud. Me? On the board that once fined me for accusatory behavior? Still, I had to admit it was poetic. I thought about it for a few days before replying. I didn't want to become what I'd fought. But I realized maybe the best way to prevent another Karen was to have someone on the inside who didn't fold under pressure. I wrote back with conditions. No arbitrary fines, no favoritism, and every complaint had to come with video or photographic evidence. They agreed. That October, I officially joined the HOA board. Not out of ambition, but out of principle. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly just email threads and occasional meetings in a too-warm clubhouse. But when someone brought up a noise complaint or a parking issue, I made sure it was handled with fairness and actual proof. No more weaponized rules. No more fake lawsuit. Just common sense and community sanity. Karen didn't take it well. When she received the official notice that I was now on the board, she stormed down to the clubhouse during our next meeting and demanded an audience. She accused the board of conspiring against her, of allowing a sewer saboteur to hold authority over her property. We calmly reminded her that she was no longer a member in good standing and would need to submit her complaints in writing like everyone else. She left red-faced and trembling. That was the last time she ever appeared in public. Then, one morning in late November, a moving truck appeared outside her house. No warning, no for sale sign update, just the unmistakable sound of boxes being loaded and furniture thumping against truck walls. Karen didn't say goodbye. No one gathered to see her off. By afternoon, she was gone. Vanished like a bad smell in a strong breeze. The house sat empty for 2 weeks, then relisted with a different agency. This time, they scrubbed the description down to just the essentials. 3-bed, 2-bath, new paint, price to move. The hot tub was never mentioned again. When the new family moved in, quiet couple, 2 small kids, a Labrador puppy, the neighborhood let out a collective sigh of relief. I introduced myself, welcomed them, and gave only the gentlest of warnings. If you ever want to use the garden spigot, just ask. They laughed and said, "Don't worry, we heard the story already. You're kind of a legend." I rolled my eyes, but inside I was proud. Not because I'd gone to war with Karen, but because I'd proven that standing up for yourself, even against petty tyrants with too much time and too little empathy, actually worked. Before the new year rolled in, I printed out one of the viral images from the news article. The moment Karen stood in her yard, covered in sewer foam, screaming into the air with the hose still in hand. I framed it. Not to gloat, not to celebrate cruelty, but as a reminder of what happens when entitlement goes unchecked. It hung in my garage, next to the breaker box, where only I could see it. And every time I turned the lights on, I smiled. And as for the little gnome with the hidden valve beneath him, he stayed where he was. His job was done, but he had earned his place in history. No one dared touch the spigot again. And no one ever looked at a hot tub the same way.